The Unseen Valor, Stories of the Medal of Honor. In the century and a half since its creation, fewer Americans have worn the Medal of Honor than have summited Mount Everest. This simple bronze pentagram, hanging from a sky blue ribbon, represents the rarest kind of courage, the sort that makes ordinary men and women, in moments of unimaginable chaos, choose to run toward danger rather than away from it. It's awarded, as the citation reads, for gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. But those words, formal and restrained, do little justice to the reality. A Japanese-American soldier continuing to advance after his arm was blown off by a German grenade, a conscientious objector lowering 75 wounded men down a cliff face under constant enemy fire, a migrant worker turned Green Beret who, despite 37 separate wounds, fought for 6 hours to save his comrades while presumed dead. These stories, spanning from the Civil War to Vietnam, crossing boundaries of race, gender, and belief, represent something more profound than mere military decoration. They are tales of moral courage as much as physical bravery, of individuals who found themselves tested not just by enemy fire, but by the very limits of human endurance and their own convictions. In their actions, we find not just the expected heroism of conventional warriors, but the unexpected valor of a female doctor crossing enemy lines, a pacifist refusing to carry a weapon, and a man who chose to return to combat after already becoming a national hero. Their stories, extraordinary yet deeply human, remind us that the greatest acts of courage often come from the most unlikely sources. Heroism Beyond Belief, the story of Roy Benavidez. The radio crackled with desperation on the morning of May 2nd, 1968. Through bursts of static, the voices of a 12-man Special Forces team begged for extraction from deep inside Cambodia. They'd stumbled into an entire battalion of North Vietnamese regulars, more than 400 enemy soldiers, and were being systematically overrun. At that moment, Master Sergeant Roy Benavidez was standing near the helicopter pad at a forward operating base in South Vietnam's Loc Nint. He wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't supposed to be anywhere near combat. Just 2 years earlier, doctors had told him he'd never walk again after stepping on a landmine. But Benavidez, the orphaned son of a Texas sharecropper who'd grown up picking sugar beets to survive, had crawled out of his hospital bed every night, dragging himself to a wall, forcing himself to stand, then to walk, then to run. Now, hearing those desperate calls, he grabbed a medical bag and sprinted to a helicopter already spinning up for a rescue attempt. He didn't know that this decision would launch him into 6 hours of hell that would become legend in Special Forces lore. Armed only with a knife and a medical kit, Benavidez leaped from the hovering chopper into the middle of an ambush. Over the next 360 minutes, he would be shot multiple times, stabbed with a bayonet, and hit by grenade shrapnel across his face and body. Yet he kept fighting. He dragged wounded men to safety while returning fire. When enemy soldiers tried to take his medical bag, he killed them with his knife. When a grenade blast shattered the stock of his rifle, he kept shooting with the broken weapon. By the time he finally collapsed on the rescue helicopter's floor, Benavidez had saved 8 men, killed at least 20 enemy soldiers, and suffered 37 separate wounds. His intestines were literally in his hands, held in by his bloodied uniform. At the evacuation hospital, the doctors initially couldn't find his pulse. They zipped him into a body bag, preparing to declare him another casualty of war. But even then, Benavidez refused to die. He mustered his last reserves of strength and spat in the doctor's face to prove he was alive. When President Reagan later presented him with the Medal of Honor, the president turned to the press corps and said, "If the story of his heroism were a movie script, you would not believe it." The assembled journalists, for once, had no cynical comeback. They knew Reagan was right. Some stories don't need embellishment, and some heroes, like the migrant worker's son who became a legend, defy even Hollywood's imagination. Defying Expectations: The Remarkable Life of Dr. Mary Walker. The Confederate soldiers who captured Dr. Mary Walker in April 1864 didn't know what to make of her. She wore a modified Union officer's uniform, carried a case of surgical instruments, and demanded to be treated as a military officer despite being a woman. The rebels settled the matter by throwing her into Castle Thunder Prison in Richmond as a spy. But Walker, the only female Medal of Honor recipient in history, had been confounding expectations her entire life. In an era when women were expected to stay home and tend to domestic duties, she had earned a medical degree, opened her own practice, and volunteered for the Union Army. When the military refused to commission her as a surgeon because of her gender, she simply showed up at the battlefields anyway, treating wounded soldiers while dodging bullets in her signature bloomer costume. Her 4 months in Castle Thunder would have broken most prisoners. The infamous Confederate prison was known for its brutal conditions and summary executions. But Walker turned her captivity into an opportunity, treating fellow prisoners while engaging in psychological warfare with her captors. She refused to wear dresses brought by Confederate women trying to reform her, instead delivering impromptu lectures on women's rights that left them scandalized. When she was finally exchanged for a Confederate surgeon, an unprecedented acknowledgement of her medical status, she returned to the Union lines and immediately resumed her battlefield work. After the war, when the Army tried to rescind her Medal of Honor as part of a cleanup of the award standards, Walker refused to return it. She wore it every day until her death, daring anyone to take it from her. "The government can create new regulations," she said, "but they cannot erase what I did." The medal stayed on her lapel, just as she had stayed on the battlefield, an unmovable force who changed the very definition of what a military hero could be. Daniel Inouye, A Heroic Journey Against Prejudice and War. On December 7, 1941, 17-year-old Daniel Inouye grabbed his medical kit and raced toward Pearl Harbor, dodging strafing runs from Japanese Zeros as he treated the wounded. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him. He was a Japanese American trying to save American lives from Japanese bombs. When he finally volunteered for military service, the Army initially classified him as an enemy alien. But for Inouye and thousands of other Nisei soldiers, the struggle to prove their loyalty would transform into one of the most remarkable combat records in American military history. By April 21, 1945, Lieutenant Inouye had already earned a battlefield commission leading the legendary 442nd Infantry Regiment, the most decorated unit of its size in U.S. military history. But what happened that day near San Terenzo, Italy, would test the limits of human willpower. Charging 3 German machine gun nests dug into a ridge, Inouye was shot in the stomach. He kept going. He destroyed the first nest with hand grenades. When a German rifle grenade shattered his right arm, leaving it hanging by a few tendons with a live grenade still clenched in its fist, Inouye pried the grenade loose with his left hand and threw it into the bunker where it had originated. Then, despite massive blood loss and the remnants of his arm dangling uselessly, he continued his one-man assault. He picked up his Thompson submachine gun with his remaining arm and charged the last machine gun position, killing the remaining Germans before finally collapsing from blood loss. When his worried men reached him, Inouye was characteristically understated. "Nobody called off the war," he said simply. Years later, as a United States Senator, when asked about that day, he would only say, "I was doing what I was trained to do. And I had a lot of great teachers." Those teachers, his immigrant parents who taught him about giri, duty, and obligation, would have understood perfectly. Sometimes the greatest battles are fought not just against the enemy, but against prejudice itself. The heroic legacy of Sergeant John Basilone. The Marines called Guadalcanal the Green Hell, but on the night of October 24, 1942, Sergeant John Basilone turned a small patch of that hell into his own private hunting ground. When a Japanese regiment, 3,000 soldiers, launched a major offensive to retake Henderson Field, they ran headlong into Basilone and his 15 men. Over the next 3 days, armed with only machine guns and his Colt .45 pistol, Basilone orchestrated a defense that would become Marine Corps legend. When his guns overheated, he lifted the searing hot barrels with his bare hands, his palms cooking against the metal. When ammunition ran low, he sprinted through enemy fire to resupply his men. At one point, trapped alone, he killed an entire Japanese patrol with just his pistol. By dawn, the bodies of Japanese soldiers were stacked like cordwood around his position. Fame transformed Basilone into America's first true World War II celebrity. War bond tours, parades, his face on recruiting posters, the Brooklyn-born son of Italian immigrants had become Manila John, the hero America desperately needed. The Marines offered him a commission and a safe assignment training recruits. But Basilone had watched too many of his friends die to settle for safety. In a decision that stunned his superiors, he turned down the commission and requested return to combat duty. On February 19, 1945, now a gunnery sergeant with a new unit, Basilone landed on a black sand beach called Iwo Jima. In the first hours of the invasion, he single-handedly destroyed a Japanese blockhouse while exposing himself to heavy fire, then guided a Marine tank through a minefield while under constant attack. Minutes later, a mortar shell found him. His men would later say that even as he died, he was shouting orders and encouragement. Manila John had lived and died as he chose, leading from the front where the fighting was thickest. His widow, Lena, would accept his second Medal of Honor at a ceremony that spring, making him the only enlisted Marine to receive both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross in World War II. Courage Under Fire, the heroic acts of Desmond Doss. The American soldiers climbing Hacksaw Ridge on Okinawa had a nickname for the 400-foot cliff face, the Rain of Steel. Japanese artillery, mortars, and machine guns swept every inch of the plateau. But on May 5, 1945, they witnessed something that defied comprehension. A lone figure darted through the apocalyptic barrage again and again, dragging wounded men to the cliff edge and lowering them to safety with an improvised rope harness. Private First Class Desmond Doss, the conscientious objector who refused to carry a weapon, had turned the bloodiest battlefield of the Pacific into his personal rescue mission. His only protection, a prayer he repeated with each trip into the kill zone: "Lord, please help me get one more." The Army had tried everything to get rid of Doss during training. Officers assigned him brutal extra duties. Fellow soldiers threw shoes at him while he prayed. A commander attempted to have him discharged for mental illness. His refusal to touch a weapon or train on Saturdays due to his Seventh-day Adventist beliefs marked him as a coward and a liability. But during 3 brutal campaigns, Guam, Leyte, and Okinawa, Doss proved that courage comes in many forms. Before Hacksaw Ridge, he'd braved enemy fire to treat wounded men in the open, crossed a heavily fortified escarpment alone to treat fallen soldiers, and was wounded by a grenade while treating others. But on that ridge, over 12 hours of continuous Japanese counterattacks, he single-handedly rescued 75 men. When he was finally wounded by a sniper and then hit by a grenade, he treated his own injuries and waited 5 hours for rescue rather than risk another medic's life. As they carried him off the ridge on a stretcher, they had to stop. Doss spotted a more severely wounded man and rolled off the stretcher, directing the bearers to take the other soldier instead. The coward had become the first conscientious objector to receive the Medal of Honor, proving that the greatest acts of valor sometimes come not from taking lives, but from an unstoppable drive to save them. The complex nature of heroism. Heroes, we like to believe, are born in singular moments of crisis. That split second when ordinary people make extraordinary choices. But the truth, as these 5 remarkable lives reveal, is far more complex. Long before Benavidez leaped from that helicopter, before Walker strode onto her first battlefield, before Inouye charged that ridgeline, before Basilone made his last stand, and before Doss climbed into hell to save one more life, each had already fought private battles that forged their character. They were shaped by poverty, prejudice, doubt, and derision. They faced systems designed to exclude them, commanders who didn't want them, and a society that often didn't understand them. What binds these stories together isn't just bronze stars and blue ribbons, it's the fierce individuality that drove each recipient to defy expectations. They remind us that valor comes not just from physical courage, but from the stubborn conviction that one person standing firm in their beliefs can change the course of history. When we pin medals on heroes' chests, we honor not just their moments of supreme sacrifice, but the lifetime of choices that brought them to that crucial point. Their legacy lives on not just in military traditions or history books, but in the profound truth they proved with their actions. That extraordinary courage can come from the most unexpected places, and that the highest form of patriotism sometimes means standing apart from the crowd, even as you stand ready to die for it.